Hi, everybody. Well, welcome back and happy Sabbath to you. Let's keep on going with our story, Treasure from the Haunted Pagoda by Eric B. Hare. Now, as you probably recall, if you've been watching before, these stories took place over 100 years ago when Elder and Mrs. Hare and their family had been missionaries in the country that it was called Burma at the time and is now called Myanmar. They had gone to dig for treasure, and it wasn't treasure like silver bricks and diamonds that were rumored to be hidden in the jungle. They were looking for people who didn't know about Jesus. And along the way, as they found many people who didn't know about Jesus and taught them about Jesus, Elder and Mrs. Hare learned some things themselves. They learned that scary things are often not that scary when you understand them. They also learned that some things which can be truly scary, truly powerful, like evil angels or diseases, even those really aren't scary when we know that God is stronger than all of them. But now, in their last few years in Burma, they were having to answer the question, is God stronger than warplanes? Is he stronger than bombs dropping from the sky? Is he stronger than enemy armies marching in? Because World War II was taking place, and the Japanese army, which was fighting against the American army and other armies, was invading into the country of Burma. And so all the missionaries who were there were having to try to evacuate. The missionary families had been trying to get out, women and children getting out on boats, and they were having a hard time doing that. Missionaries themselves were trying to get in touch with the Christian natives in their jungle villages and their schools, and were having trouble reaching them. They were all beginning to doubt, was God really in control? This was a real test of their faith. Now, as we left off last week, there were two remaining families with children who needed to be evacuated out of Rangoon, the capital city, before Elder Hare, as well as three other missionaries in the city, Elder Christensen, Elder Meline, and Elder Baldwin, could pack up and start driving cars along a long road out from Rangoon and all the way to India to safety. But as they had brought those last two families to the boat that had space for them and got them on after waiting for hours, suddenly the announcement came out, everybody off the boats. What now, thought Elder Hare. What are we going to do? We can check for other options, maybe trains, maybe trucks, maybe trains. There really weren't very many options. Well, they looked into the train option and they found out the military had taken control of the trains as well. And the military did make an announcement. There will be 4 trains leaving tomorrow. Those are the last 4 trains that will carry passengers out of the city. And in 48 hours from now, we're going to close the city down. Any cars or trucks that are left behind will be destroyed. Everyone needs to get out of the city. Things are becoming very tight. Elder Hare and his other missionary companions really needed to get these families out so that they could then pack their 2 cars with as much as they could fit and escape the city also. How were they going to get these 2 families onto the train? They knew there'd probably be already people waiting there at the train station too. Why don't we just go there right away, said Elder Hare. Even though it was evening, let's go there. We'll all sleep outside the train station. And then hopefully in the morning, you can get on the train. When they arrived at the train station, there were already thousands of people there. You couldn't even get into the train yard itself. You couldn't get to the ticket windows or to the train house. You had to just wait outside of the fences. And there were thousands of people sleeping, standing, lying down all around the train area. They didn't have any tickets, or rather, Elder Hare didn't have any tickets for his 2 families. They had just arrived. They couldn't even make it to the ticket window. They didn't have any permits or special passes. What were they going to do? Well, they did the only thing they could do. They prayed. And as they were praying about it, they got as close as they could to the fence. And lo and behold, on the other side of the fence, one of the British soldiers who was standing there on guard looked through the fence and said, "Hey, there, Mr. Hare. Is that you?" And Elder Hare looked around. Who would even know him here? And it was a British soldier who had already been working with Mr. Hare when he was helping out with the volunteer ambulance service. He recognized him and he said, "Hey, you, come here, come here." And Elder Hare went up close and the man whispered to him and said, "I know you need to get those families out, don't you? Well, I'll tell you what, you meet me over by that gate in just a few minutes and we'll let you in through there." And sure enough, even though they had no tickets or passes or permits, within just a few minutes, Elder Hare's 2 families that were needing to be evacuated were able to go through the gates and get onto the train. And that following morning, as the train chugged out of the station, one of the last 4 trains out of Rangoon, those missionary families got out and they were safe. Well, the following day, Elder Hare and the other 3 men spent packing because now they had just over 24 hours to be able to get everything together and get out of there. Now, I mentioned they had 2 cars. There were 4 missionaries. They were each going to pack 1 suitcase each. Then they needed to fit into the car gas cans, food baskets, and water jugs, which meant that most of their other belongings would have to be left behind. And this was a hard experience for them, because it wasn't just that they had belongings that were nice and that they spent money on. These were belongings that they had been using or were planning to use to reach more people for Jesus. Probably the hardest thing for Mr. Hare to leave behind was 7 brand new brass musical instruments that he had purchased while he had been on furlough in America, that he'd been planning on being able to give to the children who attended the Onda Mission School so that they could learn to play more music and go reach more people in the jungles for Jesus. He could not fit a single instrument into the car, not when space was so tight. He felt so sad. And even then they were wondering, with the 2 cars and 4 men, will we even be able to fit what we need to take in these 2 cars? But then a small miracle. One of the neighbors who lived next door to Elder Hare's house came over and said, listen, we're escaping on foot. We've got some men that are leading us over the mountains, so we can't take our car. Would you like to take our car? Yes, they would. They didn't want to leave the cars behind, these neighbors, because they knew that if cars were left behind, they would be destroyed. The military would actually come through and burn the cars so that the invading army, the Japanese army, would not be able to get the cars and use them or take their parts or take their gas or take their tires. Now they had 3 cars and they were able to fit a bit more of their belongings into this 3rd car. But the whole experience taught Mr. Hare the true importance of material goods, that God is more important than any belongings you might have. They got ready to leave the city. And that following morning, just before the city was going to be closed down, they drove out into the crowded roads and began making their way out. They did stop at the church. The church was still standing despite all the bombings that had taken place. There had been 92 bombings of the city of Rangoon so far by that time. And yet that church stood. They went inside, they looked around, they had one last prayer inside the church, and then they sang a verse from a hymn. The soul that on Jesus doth lean for repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never forsake. And you know, just like that hymn promised, God did not forsake them. God took care of them even during some really bad and difficult times. They drove slowly out of Rangoon on dirt roads that looked something like what you see behind me on the screen today. The roads were crowded with people walking, and along the sides of the roads, time after time, they passed cars that were on fire. Cars that had been put on fire on purpose because as they would run out of gas, the owners of the cars would set the car on fire so that the enemy army would not be able to use it. People were so sad as they left their cars behind. People were sad as they had to leave their belongings behind. People had tried to carry things out that they thought were really important to them. Unusual things, large objects like furniture dressers or nightstands. And then they would realize it was too heavy to carry and they would leave them by the side of the road. There was a lot of sadness going on the roads that day. The plan was for Eric Hare, as well as the 3 other missionaries driving the 3 cars, to follow the road north. It was going to go past Megtila, which was where the old Seventh-day Adventist training school was located, and get all the way to Maimyo. This was a town up in the northern part, in the western part of Burma, that had become the new temporary headquarters for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Burma, now that Rangoon was closed. Well, after driving 2 days along that road, covering 300 miles, their water jugs had run out. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they drank the last drop of water from their water jugs, and now they were kind of stuck because there was no options for water, at least no water that was clean. There were dirty river water with dead animals lying in them, or all sorts of nasty things that people had dumped into the rivers. They couldn't drink that water, so they got thirstier and thirstier as they kept on pushing forward. Finally, that evening, they arrived at a place where refugees were camping around a school for the night. And the men were told that there was a water spigot around one corner of the building that they could use to get drinking water. They fumbled around in the darkness. There were really no lights to speak of. And as they fumbled around, they finally found the water spigot and turned it on, ready to drink, their mouths so dry and thirsty, and not a drop came out. Some of the people who had set up their little camp, their little sleeping area near the water spigot told them, oh, the water is being rationed. They turn it off at dark and then they'll turn it on in the morning. In the morning? Oh, the men didn't think they could make it through the night without getting water to drink. They were so thirsty. So they stood together, huddled the four of them, and Mr. Christensen began to pray aloud. Lord, we're thirsty. You promised that bread shall be given and our water shall be sure. We don't need bread right now. We just really need water. And as they were praying, a voice called out of the darkness, "Is that the voice of Pastor Christensen?" They found who was calling to them, and it was a young man. His name was Mr. Hearn, and he had attended some of the meetings at the Adventist churches in Rangoon. He recognized Pastor Christensen's voice, and when he saw the four men and realized how thirsty they were, he said, "I have some water. I knew they were going to shut the water off at sundown, so I filled up 2 large jugs here in my car. You can have some. And I've even been cooking a meal of rice and curry, and I have extra if you'd like to have that too." Praise the Lord. Even though all they'd really asked for in their prayer was water, they got food too. They slept that night, and the next morning, they prepared to drive the next 200 miles that remained to get to Maimyo. But as they were getting their cars ready to take off, Elder Hare checked his car, and he realized the supply of gas in his car was actually running low. He wasn't going to have enough gas left to get to Maimyo. He went over and he whispered to Mr. Moline, "My car, it's running low on gas. And this whole time that we've been driving the last 2 days, we've passed gas station after gas station, all of which are closed, locked up. There's nowhere to purchase gas. What are we going to do?" Well, and then at that moment, somehow, despite the fact that Elder Hare had been whispering this to Mr. Moline, a truck driver who was nearby overheard what he said, and he called Elder Hare over. "Hey, you said you need gas? Here, you can have 4 gallons of gas from my truck." It was another small miracle. Well, they began driving along, and on the way to Maimyo, there were many difficult patches of road, and there were times when they would have to cross also rivers that didn't have any bridges, or that the bridge wasn't working well enough to be able to use it. And so they'd have to cross the river itself by driving down one steep and sandy embankment, cross the shallow, muddy river, and then drive up the other side. It was while they were crossing a river near the small town of Mergway that Mr. Baldwin's car burned out its clutch. Now the car could barely limp along. It was going very slowly. And it's a good thing it was going slowly, because within just a couple of miles, Mr. Christensen's car started making a weird grinding noise from one of the wheels. And then when they pulled over to check what was going on, they found the problem. The hub of the wheel had snapped free. The wheel wasn't attached properly to the car anymore. 2 of their 3 cars were having trouble, and just within a few minutes of each other. How could this be? Wasn't God watching out for them? They were able to get some of the passing trucks to tow the 2 damaged cars up a little ways to the actual town of Mergway. There they found a bicycle repair shop. And when they asked around, the men who worked at the shop said, "Well, we could probably fix that clutch. It would take us about 24 hours to get it taken care of, but we don't have any welding equipment, and that's what you need to fix the broken wheel that snapped off." The men thought a bit more, and Elder Hare decided he would take that broken wheel in his car, the only car that was still working, and he would proceed on ahead to the next town about 30 miles away, where there would, since it was a bigger town, there would hopefully be some repair garages that would have a welder. He got to the town and began to ask around, and every shop, the answer was the same. "Nope, can't do any welding here. All the welders already evacuated. They've headed out with the army to try to help them. Nope, no welding here." Walking dejectedly down the main street of the town, Elder Hare ran into another man who spoke English. His name was Mr. Lawson, and he was the representative of a British oil company. And when Elder Hare told him his problem, Mr. Lawson replied, "Well, I don't know any welders, but I do know the boss of the oil fields here. You should go see him right through that door over there." Well, it didn't seem to Elder Hare that would help to talk to a boss. He needed somebody who could weld, not somebody who knew how to manage a business. But he went over to the door that had been pointed out to him and knocked on the door. And when it was opened by a servant, he introduced himself, and the servant led him into an office. And in the office sat a nicely dressed, pleasant Indian gentleman. The man listened as Elder Hare explained his situation. And then he looked over at Mr. Lawson, who had followed Elder Hare in, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Lawson, you should try taking Mr. Hare here over to the oil field. I think our boys can fix up the problem for him there. Oh, yes." And with his eyes wide open, Elder Hare said, "Thank you." And an hour later, he and Mr. Lawson arrived at the oil field that had been indicated. When they arrived, Mr. Lawson hopped out of Eric's car and called out, "All right, boys, stop work. The boss has a rush order. Come over here. We need some help fixing this wheel hub." And within 30 minutes, they had welded the broken portion of the wheel. And Elder Hare was back in the car, heading back down towards Mergway. Along the way, as he drove back into the main town that he had just left, he said to Lawson, "Listen, how much is the bill? I want to pay you, of course." And Mr. Lawson replied, "There is no bill, sir. No, no, no. Just make sure you stop in to thank the boss." Well, Eric promised to do so. He drove on down the road back to the little town of Mergway and the bike shop. When he arrived there and showed the men the wheel was working, they were amazed. They had been praying the whole time that Elder Hare would be able to find a way to get that wheel welded. They had good news too. Their clutch had been fixed. The clutch on the other car had been fixed. So now all three cars were ready to go. With a little tinkering and repair, the cars all drove back up the road to the larger town where Mr. Lawson and the nice Indian boss had been. When they stopped in to thank the boss, all four of the missionaries gathered into his office, thanked him so much for his intervention. He waved their thanks away and said, "Are you sure you don't need some gasoline too? We might have a little bit, you know. The government came by and confiscated all the gasoline to use in the military trucks, but somehow we have a little bit that has remained hidden in the garage." And sure enough, gasoline was available for them as well, even though they hadn't asked for it. So many miracles had taken place within a short span of time. And as those three cars drove on up the road now to Maimio, where the headquarters was located, Elder Hare, Elder Christensen, Malene, and Baldwin all were praising God. They were praising God, and they realized they weren't just praising God for the good things he had done, but even for the bad things. Wait, praising God for the bad things? What does that mean? Here's how they learned to praise God for bad things. Those next 2 days, as they drove up to Maimio, they had to cross 10 more rivers that didn't have any bridges. Those bridges had steep banks. You had to drive down the steep bank. Then you had to go through deep sand until you got to the dried up river, to the riverbed or a small trickle, because it was the hot season. The rivers weren't very deep and wide for the most part. And as they would cross the muddy river, they would see other trucks that had been stuck in the mud and were having to be pulled out. As they would drive up and down the steep banks, they would see cars that had burnt out their clutches or broken their axles trying to navigate these terrible situations that cars really weren't designed to handle. And at each river that they would drive through, Elder Baldwin would say, "Well, I'm glad my clutch burnt out by Mergway. I mean, imagine if it had burnt out in this muddy river." And each steep riverbank that they drove out, Elder Christensen would say, "I'm glad my wheel broke down there by Mergway instead of on this steep riverbank. Imagine if we'd gotten stuck here." Yes, all things do work together for good, the Bible says. And it's not just good water showing up when you don't have water, or good gasoline showing up when you don't have gas, but also bad things like a broken wheel or a burnt clutch happening at just the right time. Yes, Elder Hare really learned how to praise God for the bad things then too. Well, they did arrive to the church headquarters in Maimio, and they were heartened to find out that the printing press there was still running, printing out Sabbath school lessons and devotionals, and being able to distribute those to the Burmese and Karen SDAs, Seventh-day Adventists, who were still in the area, and some of the native Christian leaders who were going to be staying behind in the country to try to minister to the occupants of the country while the Japanese invaded. The Japanese did keep invading. 2 weeks later, word came there to Maimio that the Japanese army had made it all the way to the capital city of Rangoon now. And the word came out, all foreigners really need to leave the country entirely now. There's no place that's safe. The Japanese will continue to spread through here and they will capture you. You need to escape. By this point, Elder Baldwin already had left for India. So there were 2 cars left. And now Elders Hare, Christensen, and Malene loaded up those 2 remaining cars with 30 gallons of gasoline. Their plan was that they had enough gas in order to be able to get down to the dock at Mingyang. Mingyang was on the shores of the Irrawaddy River. It was a fairly large river, even during that dry time of year. They would go down there where there were large boats that went up and down the river, and they would hire a boat to be able to take their 2 cars down the river all the way to Pakuku. Once you got to Pakuku, you could get onto a cart track that went meandering up through the mountains that separated Burma and India to be able to escape into the safe country of India. That was their plan, but that wasn't how things worked out. First of all, when they arrived at the dock in Mingyang, the word came to them, no, there's no large boats going down the river to Pakuku now. All the large boats have been commandeered. Commandeered boats, commandeered trains, commandeered gas. It was so difficult to travel. But another problem they run into was that since it was the dry season, the Irrawaddy River, even though it was a very large river, had shrunk quite a bit. It was much narrower now. And so where the dock stood in the city of Mingyang, the river wasn't reaching up to the dock. The river was 3 miles away, and to get there, you had to cross very deep sand that normally would be underwater in order to be able to arrive to the river itself, where they had some floating docks that people could use to board onto the boats there. Another challenge. So Elder Hare, the other two men, hired a bullock cart to take them through the deep sand all the way up to the river's edge. There they saw many small cargo boats all lined up in the water next to these floating docks. No large boats, though. Just as they had been told, the larger boats weren't going down the river anymore. They looked and they thought and they prayed. And then Mr. Christensen had an idea. Hey, you know what we could do? If we could get 2 of these small cargo boats and tie them together, connect them up in some way, and then lay planks across the 2 of them from the sides, we could drive our cars onto those planks, basically park the cars across 2 boats and sail those boats on down the river. It'd be kind of like a raft. That's an idea, said the other men. Let's try it. They went along now asking people to let them use their boats, to rent their boats to them and take them down the river in this newfangled 2-boat raft idea. All the boatmen refused. I've never heard of such a thing before. I've never seen such a thing before. Oh, no, that would sink my boat. I will not do it. That was the response they got from everybody. And the more that they tried and walked along, the more that the other boatmen they had already asked followed along behind them, mocking their plans and telling the other boatmen, don't listen to these crazy white men. They just are so out of their mind. Don't try to help them. It was so discouraging, but they did finally run into one boatman who did own 2 boats and said he'd be willing to try as long as they would pay him well. The men told him they would pay him, and they gave him a deposit of a certain amount of money and said, okay, if you can provide the planks and get your boats tied together, we'll work on getting our cars down here. Through the sand, said the boatman. You're going to drive your cars through that deep sand? I don't think you'll ever make it. Well, if we don't make it, you get to at least keep the money that we've given you already. But please get things ready for us. Okay, said the boatman. They made their way back by bullock cart across the 3 miles of sand to the town of Mingyang. And the following morning, they took their cars and began to drive across the sand. And it was hard work. They had to be very careful not to get stuck. But with a lot of prayer and a lot of patience and skill, they made their way across the sand, finally arriving at the shores of the Irrawaddy River. And there they found the boatman. And his boats were not tied together, and there were no planks on the boats. And his eyes were kind of big as he saw them. And he said, oh, I didn't think you were going to make it. Well, we did make it, they said. Now, where's the planks? And let's get these boats put together. Oh, well, I did send someone to look for planks, but the sawmill in the town of Mingyang is closed. And we have no other sawmill around. I don't know what we're going to do. Poor frustrated missionaries looked at each other, and they asked the boatman if perhaps someone could go and at least try to find some old boards from an old house or a construction site or something. So someone was dispatched off to look for planks while they got the 2 boats tied together. By the time they had the boats tied together, in a couple of hours, the man came back with some boards. One plank was 20 feet long, which was a good length, but it was only 6 inches wide. Not a very good length. Not a very good width. Very hard to keep a car tire balanced on that. The other plank was only 8 feet long instead of 20 feet long. And while it was beautifully flat on one side, the other side of the board was round. This did not look very sturdy, and Mr. Hare really did not believe that this was going to hold up the cars. But the boatman said, no, it's okay. We'll prop up a lot of bamboo underneath the boards, and we'll have lots of our helpers, lots of the workers called coolies standing by, and they'll help us and we'll get this on. All right, I guess we'll try, said Elder Hare. So the men lined up their 2 boats as the planks got put into place. The planks had to form a ramp to get up, and then they would have to use those planks to also cross over onto the boats. They began to drive the first car up onto these awkward looking planks propped up by bamboo. And as they got the car about halfway between the shore and the edge of the boat, a cracking sound began to make itself heard. And quickly, everyone pulled on the ropes that they were using to navigate the cars, pulled backwards and dragged the car back to shore just before one of the planks broke all the way through. Back again onto the shore now, stuck. Even though they had a boatman who had promised to take them, even though there was a plan, they didn't have the planks that they needed. It was already getting past the middle of the day, so there was no reason to load the boats on now. They needed to leave early in the morning instead of leaving in the middle of the day. So they were going to be stuck on shore the rest of that day and night. The three missionaries set up camp around their cars. They ate, they drank water, and they tried to ignore all the boatmen who had gathered uncomfortably close by to jeer at them, to laugh at them, to point fingers and talk to each other about these crazy white men. And after a while, the conversation became a little bit meaner, along the lines of, I can't wait to get those cars when these white men abandon them. Yeah, I'm going to take that suitcase when they leave it behind, because they're not going to be able to take that with them either. Nope, they're going to leave all their belongings here. They'll end up just having to take a canoe down the river. Ha ha ha. And the boatmen laughed and laughed late into the night. It was hot and dusty. And then some of the boatmen began talking about how the Japanese army had come even closer. The Japanese army had made its way very rapidly up the road from Rangoon toward Maimyo. In fact, they were probably only about 40 miles away now. This was so uncomfortably close. Elder Hare began to really feel like how the children of Israel must have felt on the shores of the Red Sea. An enemy army coming from behind and no way to cross. So he did the only thing he could do. That whole night, Elder Hare prayed, kneeling next to the car, praying, discouraged, feeling like hopeless, but still praying to God. God, how are you going to deliver us? How are you going to get us out of here? How are you going to get our cars on the boats? What are you going to do? And what do you need us to do? Show us what to do, God. The jeering and laughter of the boatmen continued on late into the night as the men drank alcohol and sat around their fires, laughing, talking even more loudly now about how they wanted to just take those cars away. Those white men didn't deserve to have those cars. Those should belong to them. The boatmen could get more use out of them. Mr. Hare tried to block those jeering sounds out of his ears and continued to pray. And he continued that way, begging God to show him a solution, begging God to send him an answer until 4 o'clock in the morning. And that's when an answer finally came. Now, if you want to know what that answer was, you're going to need to tune in next week. Unless, of course, you want to cheat just a little bit. Because if you go and listen to the Your Story Hour story called Prayer Planks, the entire story is there. But otherwise, tune in next Sabbath, and we'll continue to find out how God gets them through this latest challenge as Elder Hare and these other missionaries aim to serve him and to please him and to teach others about him. Thanks for listening. See you next Sabbath. Bye.